My name is Jim, and we're going to be talking about what to look for when buying a Bridgeport milling machine. Today on
Kilimanjaro.
In my first video, I talked about why you want a Bridgeport milling machine, what it can do. In my second video, I talked about what all these dials and handles do on it and how to use one. And today, we're going to be talking about what to look for if you want to actually buy your own. So this is a Bridgeport milling machine made by the Bridgeport company, which has been owned by a bunch of various companies over the years. It was built in 1974. It is a 2J head, and it's got a 42-inch table on it. So that's my milling machine. These mills have been made for close to 100 years now, and there've been a various number of different iterations on them made just by the Bridgeport milling machine company. Now there's also been, because it's been so long out of patent and so desirable and so common, there's been a lot of knockoffs of it. Now some of the knockoffs are smaller, some of them are cheaper, some of them are a little better and improved, some of them are more expensive. A lot of them now are made overseas. There are still a couple that are made in the US, and Bridgeport still makes their very own milling machine in the US as well. So I'm not going to go into too many details about what to look for in other models of them. The Bridgeports themselves tend to command a little bit of a premium because of the name Bridgeport, and also because it's a more well-known thing. You know that if you're going to get some accessory or something, and you've got a real Bridgeport, it's going to fit on a real Bridgeport. If you have a different model of vertical milling machine, even if it looks exactly the same, that accessory might not fit. You might not be able to find parts for it, that sort of thing. So the Bridgeports do command a little bit of a premium for that reason. If you happen to find a Bridgeport or another manufacturer that makes something that looks like a Bridgeport, and it's a good deal, there's probably nothing wrong with that, but it depends on who makes it, and you really want to do your own research into that sort of thing. Some of them are pretty poorly built, some of them were designed to be lighter, smaller, some of them were just designed to be cheaper. So you got to keep your eye out and do a little research if you find one that is of a different make than actually a Bridgeport. Of the Bridgeports themselves, this is a 1974 model. So I can tell what year it was made by the serial number on the table. That's right down here. So you can find that serial number. You may have to move a little cover out of the way, but you look that serial number up online and you can figure out how long ago it was made. Doesn't tell you a whole lot because it could be that it was, it's only 10 years old, but it's been run 3 shifts a day, 24/7, really abused and could be in really poor shape, or it could be from the 60s and be close to 50, 60 years old, but never really touched and really well maintained. So it doesn't really tell you much, but it's kind of interesting to know. So on the base part of the machine, this is the head of the machine and this is the base, and they were kind of two separate things. They evolved differently over time. So the base part of the machine, the original design had back here, instead of this kind of dovetail casting up here, it had a round ram. Around the 50s, they switched over to this dovetail design. And that's more desirable, it's more rigid, and it's generally stiffer and works a little bit better. The older machines, they're still useful, you can still use them for a lot of good things, but this dovetail design is a lot more desirable, and of course the ones with the round ram are going to all be 70 years old at this point, so they're probably not going to be in the greatest shape. So you really want to be looking for one that has this kind of dovetail design. Now on the head itself, same thing with the base. They've evolved it numerous times over the years. They started with what was known as the M head. It's a light kind of milling head. It's much less substantial than this head. Then they went to a J head, and then they went to a 2J head, and then they went to a 2J2 head. And there's all slight differences. The biggest thing you want to look for is the size of the motor. This has a 1.5 horsepower motor. That's plenty for anything that you're going to be doing on a Bridgeport. If you need more horsepower than that, your machine isn't going to have enough rigidity anyway, so it's not going to matter. The more desirable option is to have this variable speed option here. So when I turn this crank, it changes speed. That's very convenient. The other option on the older style heads, the J heads, is there's an opening here where you can switch belts. Now if you get a variable frequency drive, which I'll talk about a little bit later, you can overcome some of that by using that drive to change the speed, so it's not as critical. But this variable speed option is super handy to have. So that's the difference on kind of identifying the different types of Bridgeports and what you might look for. The last thing is the table width here. Bridgeports started out with about a 30-inch table, and there were different options over the years, and they kind of got bigger over time. Some say that they're not really well designed to handle those bigger tables. This is a 42-inch table here, and that's kind of standard, particularly for this mid-70s, early 80s kind of range. They then went to a 48-inch table. I've seen ones as small as like a little 9-inch table. I don't know if that was from the factory or somebody cut down a bigger table, but there are all sorts of ranges out there for certain specialized applications. The 42 inch is very handy. The 48 inch would be even more useful, but I think you do run into some extra wear issues from the extra weight of that table. So the 42 inch I think is kind of in the sweet spot, and it's the most common. So now let's talk about trying to figure out the condition of a Bridgeport. Milling machines are available brand new from the factory still to this day, and they cost about $25,000. On the complete other end of the spectrum, you have one that is just completely rusted, completely worn out, things are broken on it. It's really only worth scrap value at that point. And that, in mid 2023 is worth, somewhere around $400 for scrap value. It does depend on where you're living. So the condition has a huge range and a huge impact on the price. Now, the price also is affected by where you actually live and where you're looking to buy one of these. If you were living in an area where there were a lot of these produced when Bridgeport was, making them at their heyday in the kind of mid 70s time frame, if you live in an area that was very highly manufacturing oriented during that time period, there's going to be a lot of these around from places that have shut down, places that still exist and have just outgrown them, or what have you, things like that. If you live in a place when in that time frame, kind of the mid 70s time frame, there wasn't a lot of manufacturing, there probably aren't going to be that many of these around, and the ones that are around are going to be likely a lot higher priced. So in my area, in the Northeast, in the New Jersey, Philadelphia area, these go for about $1,500 for one that's in reasonable condition, and of course then it goes up depending on how much how good the condition is from there. So one thing that you have to be very careful about when you're assessing the condition is to not just look at the cosmetic condition. A lot of people out there will do a rebuild on them where they just take the paint off and repaint it, and that's it. And it looks really nice, but it's still completely worn out and it's still a piece of junk, and they want, top dollar for it. Other people will go through and do a complete tear down, a complete rebuild. There's companies out there that will rebuild these from the ground up. Now that costs about $9,000 or $10,000. So if you see one that someone is advertising as being completely rebuilt, and they're only asking, say, $4,000 for it, it hasn't been completely rebuilt, because that's way too little money for a mill in that condition. They've probably just repainted it, maybe touched up the ways a little bit, something like that. So you have to be very careful out there. If something sounds like too good of a deal, obviously it's probably too good of a deal. But that's not to say that there aren't great deals out there, particularly for some of these where someone bought one of these a long time ago from their old shop, brought it to their house, and then they retired and they never really used it, and now their widow is trying to sell it. Sometimes those machines saw very little use. They may have been very well maintained, inside in climate controlled conditions. These things will last forever, so that may be the condition, and you may be able to find a really good deal for these. One of the big expenses of buying one of these, however, is transporting it. If you hire somebody to try and move this for you, you're probably going to spend $3,000 or $4,000 paying somebody to move a machine that's not even worth that much. So you've got to be careful about that sort of thing, and if it's in a difficult to get to location, you may need some ingenuity to get out of there. If it's in a basement or in a garage in a small door or something like that, can be quite a hassle to get those out there. So be aware of that. If the advertiser says that they can load it for you, that's a big plus there. But they may be charging more for that capability. So to actually look at the condition of a Bridgeport, I'm going to say mine is kind of on the low end of average condition for this kind of 1970s vintage. Now that's not to say I can't make really nice parts on it. I've made parts with excellent tolerances on it and not had really too many difficulties, but it's certainly far from perfect, and it is pretty worn. So the main thing that you want to look at is the wear between the table here and the knee here. So there's two ways that these ride on. They're dovetail ways, and you can see as I turn this handle, it goes back and forth on this one and back and forth in this direction as well. So these ways are what wear the most. As the table gets slid back and forth, just hundreds of times every day, that will wear out the steel that's on these castings, and eventually that's going to cause problems. So to check for that, there's a couple things you can do. The first thing you can do is, the most obvious, is that when these ways were first done, they were ground and then scraped. And the scraping does two things. They can scrape them to make sure that those two mating surfaces, those two steel surfaces, are perfectly flat, perfectly aligned, and really have really nice tolerances, which lets everything slide better and holds everything really nice and tight together. So to do that, they use a carbide blade on the end of either just a steel rod or something that looks kind of like a Sawzall, a power scraper type thing, and they'll scrape these down. And that leaves a very distinct pattern when they do that. So there's a little half moon shape on here, and you can usually see it on the part of the ways that don't get worn very much. So this end right here almost never gets used because the table is almost never at that end. And so you should be able to see that pattern there unless it's really worn out. And then as you transition farther into the machine, that pattern will disappear if it's got a fairly large amount of wear on it. If it has no wear on it, you'll still see that pattern all the way through. Now, the problem with that is it's very easy for someone who's being a little less than honest to just go through here and throw a new scrape pattern on there. It takes about 10 minutes, it doesn't do anything, and it just looks pretty, which if you see a machine that generally looks kind of worn and stuff, but the ways look real nice, they've got that nice scraping pattern on them, and something doesn't smell just right, and it's got a brand new paint job on it, there's a good chance that somebody is being a little dishonest and has just gone through and re-scraped it, and there's nothing else done to really refurbish it. So there's a couple different ways you can tell if it's actually worn out or not. So the first is you just turn the candle here, and this should turn smoothly, and as it gets towards the middle, the part where it's more worn, it'll get easier to turn, and then when you get towards the end, it'll get harder to turn. Now if there's a huge difference there, if it's really easy in the center and it's kind of sloppy feeling in the center, and then towards the end it's really stiff or you can't even move it all the way to the end, that's a good indication that it's really worn and really past its useful life at that point. So mine, you can definitely tell, it's easier to turn in the center, and then it's harder to turn when you get to the ends, but it's not unbearably so. It doesn't bind or anything like that. And that's true on both axes, on both the X and the Y axes. You want to check both of those for play. So the next thing is, on these ways, Bridgeport in later years offered an option for them to be chrome plated. So the chrome would hold up a whole lot better than just the bare steel. Chrome is very hard, and that's why they do that. So those ways, if they're chrome plated, if they look, chrome extra shiny and things, that's a really good indication that they're probably in better shape. But you've got to be cognizant of the fact that only this surface is going to be chromed. The mating surface on the other side is not chromed, that's just bare steel. So while this surface could be in really good shape, the mating surface itself could be very worn out. So once again, you want to test this and see if it's, if it travels smoothly and everything like that. The thing is, you shouldn't get all bent out of shape about the condition of the ways and, if there's scrape marks still there or if it's perfect or anything like that. You can end up going and looking at a ton of different Bridgeports and being way too picky. And even a Bridgeport like this, like I said, with those scrape marks completely gone in the center, still makes plenty of good parts and still can do you wonders for your career and everything. So last thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that there's no grooves in here. If the wipers that are down in here, which I'll talk about in a minute, if the wipers are missing and chips get in here, you can scratch up these ways and it can score them, and then it really needs to be refurbed. It's kind of trashed at that point. One other way you can check the condition of the ways on a Bridgeport is to grab the end of the table and pull it and see if it locks back and forth or not. Now this is a very imprecise measure, but we're going to put a dial indicator on there to see just how far it moves. So if we put the dial indicator here and then we adjust it so that it's measuring the play in the knee here, we can now see as we pull on the table, you can see some movement on the dial indicator. Now this is going to change depending on where you are in the ways, so you may want to check it in a couple different spots. I'm not sure it's worth going into this if you're going to look at a Bridgeport. If you really want to do your homework, you can, but you may start irritating the seller if they think they're offering a good price and you start pulling out a dial indicator and trying to measure some of this stuff. The other thing with doing this, if it wiggles a whole lot and you can really feel it moving, that's probably not a good sign. But it may just be that the gibs are not adjusted properly. So in these ways down here, there's a tapered wedge that slides in and out with a little adjustment screw. I'll show it to you in a sec. And when you tighten that, that'll tighten this up. So it may just be an issue that those gibs aren't tight. But it does give you a little bit of information. I've heard that 6 thousandths is a good amount of play in here, but you can see mine has probably twice that, and it's still perfectly fine. So I've got you zoomed in so you can see just how much wiggle there is here. So you can see there's about 15 thousandths of play in it. That's probably more than I want, but it's a very imprecise measurement depending on where I've got the dial indicator, where in the ways I am. It can vary quite a bit. And like I said, it may be just due to the gibs not being adjusted properly. So the gibs, if we take these 3 screws out and take this way cover off here, and this is what keeps those ways clean, Over under this side here, there's a screw head, and that moves the tapered gib in and out. Now in mine, it's all the way in, which means that there's no more adjustability on there, which is why I can't tighten this up anymore. So if you really want to do a thorough job at inspecting a Bridgeport, you might want to take that cover off and look to see if that gib is all the way down. However, it may not actually matter because, like on mine, if I'm at one end of the travel, that gib is actually a little too tight. I can't really get to the end of the travel, it starts to bind up. In the middle, it's pretty good, but it's probably a little looser than it should be, and that's because the ways are worn unevenly. And this measures both the y-axis ways and the x-axis ways. So the x-axis ways, the gib is tucked up underneath in here, and it's the same thing. If it's too tight on the ends, it's going to bind, and in the middle, it's going to be too sloppy. So you can play around with that a little bit and see if you can get this a little bit tighter. But even with this level of slop here, you can still make perfectly good parts. So that was the condition of the base, and I think the condition of the base is really what drives the vast majority of the cost of a Bridgeport. If that's in poor shape, you're kind of out of luck. You're going to have to spend many thousands of dollars, many hours regrinding and redoing those ways so that they're in, factory condition. I didn't talk about the ways that hold the table to the column, the knee to column ways. Those tend to be in generally fairly good shape. There isn't usually a lot of wear on those. You don't usually move the table up and down constantly as you're using it, so they tend to be in better condition, but it's something you should take a look at as well. So then we get to the head of the Bridgeport. And this, of course, obviously is very important as well. It's a little easier to deal with if it's not, but if you're looking at the kind of $1,500, $2,000, $2,500 level Bridgeport, you'd want this to still be in pretty good condition because it's not really going to be worth your time and money to redo this if it's not. So if it's under power, obviously the best thing you can do is turn it on. So if I turn mine on, you can hear that it sounds pretty smooth. That noise at the end there was actually the fan on my VFT, not the Bridgeport itself. So it sounds pretty smooth. There's no knocking noises, no grinding noises. Everything seems to spin freely. If you grab the nose down here, you can kind of turn that a little bit and it all feels nice and smooth. So that's kind of the most important thing. Some other things to look at, just kind of general quality. One thing that frequently happens on Bridgeports and is on mine here, this is the quill lock lever. So if I push this all the way down, now the quill is locked and in one position. It should be kind of under a spring tension that it'll stay kind of where you put it. Mine just kind of flops down. If I put it all the way up, it'll stay there, so that's nice, but you really want it to be able to stay kind of here without having any difficulties. So, but like I said, it's not a big deal, and it's not something that is very easily to repair, so keep that in mind. On the inside of the taper of the Bridgeport, so this is an R8 taper that the tools slide up in, so there's a little taper at the bottom here. So there is a little pin inside here that this groove rides in when you slide this up in here. And that pin should be in good condition. That helps you put the collet in. However, if it's not there, I've heard of some people that just take them out entirely. You can still get it in and out, so it's not the biggest deal. So it may be worthwhile, though, to take a collet and put it in there, tighten it down, see how it feels when you tighten it down. So if the Bridgeport isn't under power, there's not a lot you can do to check the condition of the head itself. Well, really the only thing you can do is grab the nose of it, spin it around a little, make sure it feels smooth. It's very difficult to get this open to take a look at it, so there's not really a whole lot you can do there. If the bearings are completely shot, you're going to be able to tell. You could take a dial indicator, put it on the bore of this taper here, and see if there's a ton of run out, but it's going to be pretty difficult to assess the condition there, so it's kind of hit or miss at that point. The motor may not work. Motors are fairly easy to replace. They're not that expensive, but it's definitely a risk that you take. Now, the last thing is the condition of the table itself, this surface right here. That's going to have a lot of dings and nicks and things like that on it. Those generally aren't a big deal. If they're massive, if there's big chunks taken out of it, if there's a chunk that's broken off in a corner here, that could be really bad, and that might be something you might want to walk away from. Same thing if it's completely covered in rust. It's very common for these to have a little bit of rust on them, particularly if they're in a garage, something like that, where it's not climate controlled. It's very common that it's going to have a little bit of rust, particularly on the table itself. Parts like that are exposed, maybe the vise that's on it might have a little bit of rust. If the ways have rust on them, though, that's probably not a machine that you want to buy. The ways should always be covered in oil, and if the oil is gone from those ways and it's been sitting for so long that the oil has all disappeared, such that it could then rust, that machine has been sitting for an extremely long time. The rust is going to destroy those ways, so that's not something that you really want to take a look at. If the ways have a nice sheen of oil on them, that's a good sign that it's been used fairly recently and is probably in better condition. So that's how to assess the condition of the Bridgeport. Now if you're going out and looking, really what you want to avoid is one that just isn't going to be useful, isn't going to make good parts for you. And so those are the things you want to avoid: is the heavy rust, the scoring, the complete slop on the table, or the motor not working, or the spindle just being like super crunchy and having the bearing shot in it. If all those things are in reasonably good shape, you're going to be able to get some good use out of it. The next thing that's going to drive the cost of the Bridgeport, though, is the various things that come with it. So the base machine itself is very important, but what really helps you and what makes a lot of difference is things that get added onto it. Now those can all be added on later. Of course, there's additional expense on those. So if a machine has all that stuff included, that can be a big savings to going down the road, and you might want to pay a little bit more for that up front. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about there is the power feeds. So on mine here, it's got a power feed on the x-axis. So if it's got that, that's great. Some machines will have a power feed on the x, some will have them on the x, the y, and the knee. I've never seen one with just it on the y, but the x is kind of the most common. So having one power feed is super handy. More is obviously better beyond that. On the knee itself, you can actually get a little adapter for your drill, so you can use it kind of as a power feed on that if you want to move the table up and down. So that's not that big a deal if it's there or not. Like I said, you can add them on later, no big deal. They're a couple $100, so keep that in mind when you're looking at the machine itself. The next thing, and I think one that is super helpful and very nice if you can get it on the machine, is this digital readout back here. So mine is a 3-axis digital readout, so it measures the distance on the quill here, that going up and down, the table going this way, and the table going this way. That's kind of the best that you can get. I like this old style here with the old, 8-digit LEDs or 8-segment LEDs on them. I think it looks nice. I like it. I like the actual switches on it. Of course, there's lots of newer ones out there that look fancier, have more additional functions on them. Those are fine too. It doesn't really matter what they look like. I like the older style personally better though. 3-axis is better than 2-axis, but you can get away with only 2-axis if it just has the X and Y. There's add-on kits that you can put on the quill itself that's not that expensive. Once again, you can add these on later. If you want to add on a really nice one with glass scales from a reputable manufacturer, it's going to be $1,000, maybe $2,000. But there's Chinese ones out there that work perfectly well. It's what I have on my lathe, and they're only a couple $100. Of course, then you have to install it yourself. So the next thing is how you're going to power this. I'm assuming you're in a home shop here, so you're not going to have 3-phase power, which is what all these motors use. So you're going to need some sort of ability to convert your single-phase power into 3-phase power. The common way to do that now is a VFD. That's this little box here. It's a variable frequency drive, and it turns the single phase into 3-phase power for you, and also gives you some features like changing how quickly it starts and stops. You notice I have mine taking a fair bit of time to start and stop. And then some braking, and you can also slow it down. This little knob here lets you control the speed, so you can make it slower or faster. And that can be really helpful if you don't have variable drive here. If you've got the pulley drive, you can use that to adjust the speed within reason. When it drops down, it loses a lot of torque, so you got to keep that in mind with that. It's not a cure-all there. So those cost a couple $100 depending on where you get them from, and if it's a reputable manufacturer or just whatever cheap one you can find on eBay. So keep that in mind when you're getting one of these. On the head side here, there's a lot of attachments that will go on the head. You can get a right angle head that comes down here and goes off to the side. You can get some kind of detailing heads that can turn in various shapes. They can get in in various kind of under areas, undercuts and things like that. There's a slotting head that goes on here, so you can cut key slots and things like that. All sorts of different things, and they frequently might be mounted on the back of the Bridgeport here. Those tend to be extremely expensive if you want to buy them separately. So if it has one of those, that's a great deal, and that's really going to increase the value of it. The next thing is a vise. Of course, you got to have a vise to do almost all the work. You can use your strap clamps and everything just on the table itself, but vise is certainly essential. Some of them aren't going to come with a vise. Some will come with an older style. This is a genuine Bridgeport vise. It works perfectly fine, but kind of the gold standard now is a Kurt vise. If it comes with a Kurt vise, those are probably $600 or $700, I think, new. So if it's got one of those that's in good condition, that's certainly something that you want to keep in mind when you're figuring out if it's a good deal or not to get that mill. The last thing is the tooling itself, the thing that you're going to put in the mill to actually make your cut. So that can range from little end mills like this, big face mills like this, Drill chuck is always super helpful. Just a full collet set of R8 collets. These things, can add up, particularly because you're going to need a whole bunch of them. Some of them, like these face mills, are very expensive. Your general end mills aren't that expensive, but they do add up and they do wear out. So if a lot of those are included, you kind of want to consider that. And usually that stuff is going to add very little to the cost of the mill, but it might make a big deal to you to not, have to purchase that stuff in the future. Now keep in mind that a lot of the times these are going to be sold with kind of antiquated tooling that isn't really kind of what you want, and it may be a whole bunch of stuff that you're never going to use. So be very wary of assigning too much value to a giant pile of old tooling. It's probably not going to be all that useful to you. But every once in a while, one of those old pieces of tooling is exactly what you need, and it's going to save you, the hassle of finding it and the cost of it. So it can be very nice to have. That's what you want to be looking for when you are looking at Bridgeports. I think the most important thing is just to get out there, look at a couple, but don't make yourself nuts looking at hundreds of different ones, looking for the perfect diamond in the rough. If you're looking to spend $1,500, $2,000 on a Bridgeport, it's going to be in fairly rough shape. It's not going to be perfect. If you want one that's in really good shape, either expect to spend a lot more, get one from a reputable machine rebuilder, or buy one new, if that's in your budget there. If you find some that have most of the things you want on them, keep in mind you can always add all that stuff on later. As long as the ways and the quill are in good condition, you're going to be able to make perfectly fine parts with it. I think that's the most important thing, is that you want to choose one, pick it up, try to get one from a reputable seller, and bring it home and start making parts with it. If you find that it's actually in pretty poor shape, you can always get it fixed. There's plenty of places out there that will rebuild them, or you can just sell it on for a lower price, a reasonable price, and get your money back and move on and find one that's in better shape. You're still going to learn a ton even with one that is really in poor shape to have. So I think that's the most important thing. Don't get too hung up on finding one that has ways in perfect condition. And of course, as always, be wary of folks that are a little dishonest out there, folks that have just repainted them and maybe put some fancy flaking on the ways here to make it look real fancy and like it is in much better shape than it is. So that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If there's something I missed, something you think is really important to the condition of a Bridgeport, leave it a comment below. Thanks for watching.